All right, excellent. Well, we're delighted today to be joined by Margaret Kosmala, who is our guest speaker. Margaret is a data scientist currently working at CIBO Technologies, which is a company developing agriculture intelligence platforms that support regenerative farming. She has a background as a global change ecologist, and she's focused on the temporal dynamics of populations, communities, and ecosystems. So part of what that means is she has a real specialty in using data to help us understand the world at its largest scales. So that means the longest time scales and the largest distances around the globe. And she's also really made a specialty of leading citizen science projects, which is a collaborative way of doing science that engages a whole community of volunteers to help explore and also generate data sets. So I first met Margaret nearly a decade ago now, which is kind of shocking, when she joined us and also spoke at a conference called ComSciCon, the Communicating Science Conference, all about her work leading citizen science projects. At that time, she was leading Snapshot Serengeti and Season Spotter. And we're just delighted to have you join us today, Margaret, to speak to our climate justice design fellows. So I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thank you. Right, as you said, met like a decade ago. And as I was putting together these slides, I kept being like, oh, wait, like I get to put years on these so I can remember what's going on. So, okay, I'm going to talk about scalable data analysis, integrating data from people and machines. Okay, all right. And I'm going to talk about this in 3 parts. The first part is going to be about citizen science and specifically the story of Snapshot Serengeti that Nathan alluded to. The second part is going to be agricultural data integration. So that's my current job at a startup. And then the third part will be discussion, where we can talk about whatever interested you from these first 2 parts. All right, citizen science and Snapshot Serengeti. So as was mentioned, like citizen science is a way of bringing anyone who's interested, regardless of whether they've been trained as a scientist or not, and most people haven't, into scientific research in one way or another. And I was involved in a citizen science project as a scientist, as a project generator, sort of by accident. So this is the story of how that all happened. And so, yeah, I put years on these because I was like, oh gosh, that was a while ago. So in 2010, my friend and collaborator, Ali Swanson, was working on her dissertation. She was trying to figure out what she was going to do to answer the question of how all of these different carnivores interact. So we have a lion, a hyena, a cheetah, and an African wild dog. And they all live together in various parts of Africa. She was focusing on the Serengeti ecosystem, which is on the border between Tanzania and Kenya. That's that green dot there. And lions attack and kill sometimes hyenas and cheetahs and African wild dogs. And so the question was like, well, if they all compete for prey and lions even attack these other predators, how is it that they can all live together in the same ecosystem as populations? Because simple population theory suggests that like this shouldn't be able to happen. So there must be mechanisms that allow this to happen. So this was Ali's dissertation. And she had to figure out how she was going to answer this question. She came up with this, at the time, pretty novel idea of using camera traps. So you may be familiar with these. They're cameras. They're in these sort of rugged boxes. You attach them to a tree or a post, and then they're motion activated. So when an animal walks by, it takes a picture or a video or whatever you set it to take. We took pictures, or I should say Ali took pictures. This part was all just her dissertation to start with. And she thought big, and this sort of thing had really not been done before at scale. She bought a slew of cameras, got a whole bunch of money to buy a bunch of cameras, and put out 225 cameras over an area that's about a quarter of the size of Rhode Island. So big part of the Serengeti. The map in the upper right shows you where in the Serengeti ecosystem it was. It was right in the middle, on the edge between the plains, which is in yellow, and the forest. Well, the savanna, I should say, the woodlands in green. And yeah, so she had all these cameras set up, and they were activated by animals walking by. And her idea was like, hey, we'll just take a sample of all the things that are going on with the carnivores, but also all the herbivores as well in the Serengeti in this area, and then we'll be able to make some inferences about how they're sharing, how the carnivores are sharing space, and so forth. So it worked. Got pictures like this, the hyena. It sometimes didn't work because the animals are very interested in these camera traps. So this camera did not survive, nor did this one. In fact, Ali had a graveyard of cameras, but she by trial and error, she figured out how to get them to survive for longer and longer. And in the end, she was getting 1,000 pictures every day of the wildlife out in the Serengeti. And lots of pictures of animals, other things. So this is sort of a sampling of what she's getting. Yeah, in fact, it was too many photos, right? So 1,000 images a day, as you can imagine, is a lot. By 2011, she had so many photos, she was struggling to figure out how to process them, because it's one thing to have a digital photo, it's another thing to be able to say what's in the photo and then use that in your research in a meaningful way. So, so she had a small group of undergraduate volunteers helping her go through them, and it still wasn't enough. And so this is when I entered the picture. She came to me, I have a computer science background, and she said, hey, can computers help us? Like, can we somehow have like a computer like tag the animals in these pictures so that I don't have to have my small crew of undergrads do this for ever and ever, and so I can finish my dissertation at some point. And I put the date on, this is really important, 2011, the answer was no. Nope. I'll let you read this. Okay, and then of course I need to put a date on that too, because turns out this isn't really apropos anymore. Like, check to see if the photo is of a bird. We actually have technology to do that now, which is kind of cool. This XKCD comes from 2014, and it's like spot on. Like about 5 years between 2014 and 2019 was when the AI stuff really kicked off to start to be able to do this sort of thing. So I actually think this is pretty impressive. But anyway, back in 2000, where were we here? 2011. Yeah, it was just not possible. No, there's no way of doing that. But we were lucky in that there is this group called the Zooniverse, which is suddenly in very light letters there, that existed at the time, and they were looking for partners. Now, the Zooniverse is a group of astronomers and mostly computer scientists who put together originally a citizen science project called Galaxy Zoo. And this project was purely online. And what it did is it asked people to, I believe it was identify the shape or the direction of galaxies. And so it was a pretty simple question. There'd be a picture of a galaxy, you'd just say which way it was rotating, or you'd say which shape it was. I don't remember exactly. But this project was like an immense success. People loved it. All the amateur astronomers around the world loved this project. They loved being involved in research. And it was very, very successful. So this Zooniverse group, they put together a few more astronomy projects. Those were also successful. And then they kept getting funding to do these citizen science projects. They decided to expand outside of astronomy to something else. So they put out a call asking for people who'd be interested in collaborating with them to do non-astronomy projects. And so Ali and I applied and were accepted, and we started this great collaboration. They were really excited about African wildlife, and we were really excited about their computer programmers. So we put together a citizen science project called Snapshot Serengeti. And it looked like this in its original incarnation. And what we did is we showed a picture like this one of the ones from Ali's cameras, to whoever was interested, and we asked them to identify what's there. Now you might think at first, I have no idea how I'd even do that. Most people would, right? Like most people are like, I don't know, what's a topi? What's a Cory bustard? I have no idea. Now, that being said, you guys can probably do this one. What's this?
Zebra.
Yeah, right. Okay, so it's a zebra, and it's two zebras, right? So it turns out some of these, zebra, elephant, lion, people actually can do this, but the harder ones they couldn't. So we put together these the sort of tutorial lookup thing that people could use. So you could narrow it down by pattern, by color. You could identify the shape of the horns or the tail or the general animal's build, and that would narrow your prospects down by a lot. And eventually you'd get something like this. Oh, I don't know, it's an impala, and it gives you a description, it gives you an example, it gives you the most often confused with other animals so you can compare them. And then we also asked how many are there and what kind of behavior are the animals doing, and whether young are present. And then you'd click identify, and you'd move on and get another picture. So this website went live in December of 2012, and it was a huge success. We, as you do if you're at a university, we put out press releases. So the Zooniverse was based out of Oxford, and so they put out a press release, and we were at the University of Minnesota, so we put out a press release, and the media loved this, right? Like apparently, like, you know, cool pictures of wildlife go well on media outlets in quiet times, which it was then. So yeah, so we got a lot of media attention. And I remember at that point, we had about 2 years worth of camera trap images, and we assembled them into what we called seasons. And a season was about 6 months. So we had people go out into the field and collect the SD cards from all the camera traps about once every 6 months. So we had this whole collection. They'd get put on a hard drive. That hard drive would be hand couriered from Tanzania back to the States. And then we'd have a season's worth of data, about 6 months. So we had about 4 of those. And we had prepared 3 of them for the initial launch, which was a lot of work, right? So we had to give each photo an identifier and put it in a database, and all these things had to be built because they didn't exist yet. So we had those 3 seasons prepared and uploaded on the Zooniverse, and it went live. And within 3 days, all of the pictures have been classified. This was over 1 million images, and we were sort of flabbergasted. We were happy, but also panicked because we'd had so much attention. And as you know, like user attention on the internet, like fades quickly. So we didn't want to lose everyone who was interested in what they were doing. So I scrambled and got the 4th season, which is the last one we had up. And then that one so that's 6 months worth of photos. I got that up in a few days later, and that took 3 weeks to finish classifying. So we lost that, huge surge of initial interest from all the media outlets, but we had 10,000 people who were still interested in doing this. And so they classified all the rest in 3 months. So we had 2 years classified in under a month. And then we were really worried that we were going to lose everyone because they were like, we have nothing left for you to do, but the cameras are still taking pictures. Please come back. And they did. We got our next season back in, I think, February following the launch, and we were able to get that up, and people came back. And then that took a few months to classify. We thought, okay, this is going to get into a more, if it takes 6 months to classify 6 months of photos, that's fine, right? Because then we'll maintain interest. But it was a very cool project. It's still continuing. It still exists. And I guess we'll get into how we dealt with these photos and the classifications that people gave now. So one question that came up we had was like, well, if we show a picture, how do we know it's right? Like what people said is right. I discovered in like looking through the data that we didn't have anyone who was like purposely trying to tank our project, which is pretty awesome considering we had thousands of people and not one of them was trolling our site. So that was awesome. But also people can make mistakes, right? So So we're like, well, we can't just ask one person. We need to ask more than one person. And we came up with a very simple algorithm based on multiple classifications of the same picture to determine what it is. Now, something like this picture is pretty easy. Probably you would all say giraffe, right? And sure enough, the first 5 people who saw this said giraffe too. There's one and it's moving. So that's a pretty straightforward example. This one's a little bit harder. It turns out it is a buffalo. If you were to take some expert who spent time in the Serengeti and ask them, what is that? They'd be like, that's a buffalo, right? That's a little bit harder for people who are less experienced. So you can see the first 8 of the classifications here and do include a bunch of buffalo classifications, but also wildebeest and rhinoceros, which are not unreasonable. The numbers vary too, because it depends on whether you're counting those animals kind of in the background. So we had to make a decision about those. And then whether they're moving, eating, moving and eating, if some of both. And so what we ended up coming up with is an algorithm that said, once you have 10 of any classification, you would consider that to be correct. So this one will keep accumulating buffalo classifications. It would be counted as a buffalo. And then the other rule we had is stop when you get to 25 classifications. So if you've had 25 classifications and you didn't have 10 of anything, then you're done. And we just say, okay, we're just going to stop now. So here's an example where that might happen. So this is a night picture. It's hard to see what this thing is. You can see the 2 eyes and it's small. It's low to the ground. As an expert, I'd say I actually don't know what that is. It's a small something, and that's actually what we see in the responses, right? So any individual person's taking a guess, like, I don't know, it's a rodent, it's a dictic, it's a mongoose, it's a civet. I can't really tell. And what's interesting about this is that it actually gives us information, right? So everyone agrees there's one thing and it's moving, so that's useful. And then we also know it's a small mammal. Like all of those are small mammals. So even though we don't know exactly what it is, we do know it's a small mammal. So so it turns out that even when people don't agree about what something is, that can provide information. So that was an interesting discovery. And anyway, we did a analysis. We took several thousand images and we had experts classify them, and we looked at what the classifications consensus algorithm said, and it was 97% correct, which is great, which is awesome if you've got millions of photos. So we ended up writing a paper about this at some point, about data quality and how you can get higher data quality by asking more people to do the same thing. This also produced some great science. So Ali finished her dissertation in a reasonable amount of time. And there have been over 20 publications in ecology and related fields that have come out over the next decade based on the data that Snapshot Serengeti has created. And then we've had some surprise discoveries too, which is pretty cool. So here's an example. In the lower left, the smaller picture there, that's a picture of a serval, which is a cat that lives in savannas. It jumps really high and has really big ears, hunts at night. Very cool and elusive creature. You don't usually see these if you're out as a researcher. And then on the right is also a serval. This serval is all black, and so it's very, very unusual. It's the opposite of an albino. So this is a melanistic serval. It has a gene for extra melanin, and these types of melanistic animals, servals and some other animals, are generally thought to occur in mountainous habitats. So it's generally thought that there's like some advantage to this genotype being in the mountains and sun exposure and so forth. But this isn't in the mountains, this is on the plains. So this was very unusual. Everyone was very surprised to see this. But we have a few pictures of this particular serval, and then there were some others discovered several years later as well. So it was pretty neat. Snapshot Serengeti was also such a success that we started getting inquiries from everyone who studies wildlife. And they were like, hey, we want to put out camera traps too. How do you process all those images? And so this is a handful of the projects that evolved from Snapshot Serengeti. These ones are all in Eastern and Southern Africa. But there are others from all over the world that use the same general concept, which is present images to users, have them classify based on a rubric and some, tutorial and help, and then combine classifications into a single classification that is then the label for that particular image. And what's particularly gratifying is what happened after that. So in 2015, we published all the data we had, which was the first 3 years of the project and what Ali's dissertation was based on. Those 3 years were about 3.2 million images and their classifications. So all the raw classifications and the consensus algorithms classifications. So we put all of those out in the open. And this was really unusual in ecology. So some fields are more open than others, and ecology is somewhere in the middle, trending toward closed, or at least it was back in 2015. There was I think it was Nature had just started a new journal that was called Scientific Data, and you could publish just data. This used to be a thing you couldn't do. You had to write a paper if you wanted to publish your data on the side. But we published a data paper, a paper that was just about the data, how we verified our classifications, how accurate they were, the algorithm, the very simple algorithm I explained to you. And then we had to find a place to put all those images, which again, in 2015 was hard. It was like a terabyte of data, and, finding a repository where they were agreed to house a terabyte of images for free in perpetuity was very difficult. But we found a place. I think it's moved since then, but we did it. We put it all out there. And like I said, this was unusual in ecology. Wildlife ecology especially has historically been very siloed. Individual researchers really care about their niche in the science community, and they don't like to share very much. So putting all our data out there was seen as risky by our collaborators and colleagues and stuff, like, oh, you're going to be scooped. People are going to use your data. And our argument was like, there's so much data here. You could write 1 million papers on it all. Like, nobody's going to run out of stuff to write about. And what's cool about this is that this data set then became accessible to computer scientists. In particular, people who are trying to do computer vision, trying to get computers to be able to recognize objects, in this case, animals, in photos. And, around that time, the focus was all on well-positioned indoor photos, right? So like staged photos. And outdoors was a much harder area to work in. So we teamed up with a computer science lab, and they managed to come up with a really nice neural network that did a good job. They were able to classify at the same accuracy as humans. And I think, do I have that coming up? No, I don't. Okay, so I'll just say they were able to get, and they're, it did something like this, right? So the neural network algorithm that does this computer vision basically gives a weight to all of the different things. So here you can see, like, has a very high weight for impala, which is in fact what these are. Its second guess is Grant's gazelle. It thinks with about 50% confidence that there are 8 in this picture, and then slightly less confident, 7 or 6, and then the different confidence scores for the other attributes, all of which we would say are reasonable, right? So that was 2018. We published that paper. And then in 2021, a paper that I was not involved in, but also came out of this whole project, was that the people who are then running Snapshot Serengeti and a bunch of these other citizen science projects realized they could take these classifications that the computers were putting out and combine that with human identifications to have high confidence and low human effort. So in this case, they might just have one human identify this picture. And if it agrees with what the computer thought, they're done. You don't have to ask 10 people, right? And that's especially true of, the easy photos, like the giraffe photo, right? Like you don't need to ask 10 people really, do you? So that's pretty cool. So now these pictures run even faster. And that's why we're able to support so many projects, which wouldn't have been possible before, is that the computer vision algorithms are augmenting what the humans are doing so that these go faster. So this is sort of where the state of the art is right now. And it is sort of revolutionized how wildlife ecology can be done. All right, now I'm going to transition to agricultural data integration. So I left academia in 2018 and went to work for CIBO Technologies, which is a startup. Or maybe we should stop calling ourselves that at some point, but like we were a startup. And the goal of CIBO Technologies in general has been to leverage agricultural data at scale. And as a startup, you sort of pivot what you're trying to accomplish and who your customers might be and like how you sell yourself. So we're continuing to do that, but we have a good direction these days. I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing now. Okay, so let's say you want to know about a house, right? Can you do that? Sure, there's something called Zillow. This is a company that will tell you all about any house you want to know about. It'll tell you price, how many beds and baths, the square footage, when the furnace was installed, like all sorts of things, right? And it's got a clear commercial value. It's used for home purchasing and renting. So you get all sorts of information like this. What if you want to know something about a farm field, right? So this is a randomly selected farm field in Iowa. Well, there is some public knowledge, public data about farm fields. This data is a crop data layer that comes from the USDA. They put it out every year. And so you could learn that, for example, in 2021, this was a soybean field. Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, so what CIBO's trying to do is make transparent all the things you could possibly know about a piece of farmland similar to what Zillow does. So for example, we could select a farm field and learn how big it is, learn some statistics about it, or I should say indexes, the NCCPI and the CSR2, which I can talk about a bit later, where it is, what was grown on it in the past, what the estimated yield was, and perhaps something about the management practices on that field. For example, whether there was a cover crop and how it was tilled. So to provide this sort of information, we have several challenges. The first challenge is, what is a land unit? With a house, it's pretty easy. Like a house is a house. And if you're not going to actually do a house, you could do, Zillow doesn't operate on houses per se. It operates on parcels of land, right? So, you buy a house, you actually are buying a piece of land and the house that's on that piece of land. So, so that's one possibility. So that's the one in the middle there is you could divide up land by parcel, but that doesn't work as well for farmland as it does for houses. And that's because often farmers will buy several parcels and then they don't farm according to the parcel, they farm according to the land. So there's this concept called a common land unit that was produced by the USDA. We used that first. And that also had problems in that, like, those tended to be kind of big. And so they tended to have lots of different uses on them. And then they also stopped updating them. So they stopped being as useful. The parcel we just talked about, that's like ownership records. That's public knowledge somewhere, although it's generally kept by counties, so it's very fragmented public knowledge. And what we'd really like to do is be able to do a field, which is a management unit. Like that piece of land is treated the same way. And that's not available. We're actually developing technology to be able to do that right now. So we use satellite images, and we use neural networks again to do segmentation and try to figure out what is a field. The second challenge is what data matters. Like you're going to go out and try to find or create data about a field or a parcel. What are you going to try to find or figure out? Well, we decided or figured out that like there are three buckets of types of data that matter. One of those is agricultural. So are you going like, so that would be things like yield, and what the soil types are, things like that. Economic data, things like how much is this piece of property worth? Environmental data, things like the nitrogen leaching on the field or under like typical practices, or the carbon sequestration potential of a particular unit of land. So then the third challenge, and the kind of fun and interesting one, is like, how do we get the data? And it turns out we do a lot of different things to get data and then assemble it together. So one thing we do is we buy data. So for example, the parcels, we buy that. There's a couple of companies out there that go and scour all of the county records and gather them together. And that has ownership data attached to it. We find some of our data. So I mentioned the NCCPI earlier. That stands for the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index, which is a nationally produced index about like how well crops will grow in the soil, basically. And each state some states also have their own productivity indexes. So we use those as well. Third thing we do is we calculate it. So for things we can't find, like the land value, we have algorithms that we've come up with that estimate what we think the land value should be. So for example, you could think, well, the land value should be related to the productivity, and the land value may relate to how far you are from a big city, and the land value may relate to what the taxes are like in that area, and so on, right? And so we've come up with algorithms to calculate some of our metrics based on other data that we can find or buy. The next number 4 there is we model our data in some cases. So we have a crop model that is pretty sophisticated that we use for a lot of things. And one of those is to model crop yield. So we know what the soils are like in a particular parcel, and we know what the weather is like. So those are both public pieces of data. And then we have a complex crop model that will take, hey, you grew corn in this year, and we will model the growth of corn and predict the yield from that. And it's reasonably accurate. So we can estimate yield that way, and then we can remotely sense it. So for example, I mentioned we might be able to detect some cover crop practices. We use remote sensing and computer vision in combination to try to figure out what the management practices on a piece of farmland are. And then the fourth challenge is, how do we make all that data relevant? And we have 2 groups of people in the company who do that. The business development finds customers. So they have people who go out and they ask, hey, what information is useful to you? And that might be different depending on whether you're an agronomist who's helping farmers figure out what practices to use, or an insurance company that insures farmers, or a commodity, or let's say a consumer packaged goods company that buys from farmers and wants to know what practices the farmers they're buying from are using. So we have lots of different ways that this data can be used. And so that's the job of the part of the company to figure out, like, who should we sell our information to and in what way, and how do we capitalize on the information we can create for the customers. And then we have front end software engineers, this other group of people who create beautiful and easy to use interfaces, right? So those two things sort of go together. We create these interfaces, the business development people go out and show them to potential customers and say, hey, look at this, like, we think we can solve some of your problems with this. And they might say, yes, but can you do this? And then we have sort of this iterative cycle. Okay, so CIBO's current focus is on carbon credits. And a carbon credit is a unit of greenhouse gas that was either prevented from being emitted or was taken out of the atmosphere permanently. So there's a lot that I could say about carbon credits, but I'm gonna keep this relatively short. Carbon credits are part of a carbon market. The idea being that some company might find that they have to emit some carbon credits. They have to, for example, transport their ingredients, say, from one point to another, and that has to use fuel that then puts carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and they want to offset those emissions. They can buy what are called carbon credits, which is the carbon credits are produced when some other entity prevents emissions that would normally have been emitted, or takes these greenhouse gases out of the air permanently. And maybe that's all I'm going to say about that. So the idea is that farmers have these huge pieces of land, and by changing their practices from the traditional practices to what's called these days regenerative practices, they can do things like reduce the amount of fuel they use and reduce the amount of fertilizer they use, and or they can put more carbon in the soils by using certain practices. There's some challenges for the carbon credit market in general. So convincing farmers to join the program is hard. There's a lot of paperwork required, and there's relatively low payout right now for how much you can get for a carbon credit. Another challenge is convincing buyers of the credits that the credits are legitimate. So the way you would do that is to use a third-party registry to verify that the credits that are being produced on these particular fields are in fact, putting carbon into the soil, or are in fact using less than the normal amount of fertilizer. In order to do that, you need lots and lots of details from the farmers, which goes back to the lots of paperwork. And then the other thing is that soil sampling to verify that these credits are legitimate costs a lot of money. So in the end, making the economics work is the real challenge for the carbon credit market here in the US, which is a voluntary market. That means that there aren't laws that say that companies or entities have to do one thing or another. They don't have to reduce their emissions, say. But there's a voluntary market because there's a lot of pressure on companies from shareholders and other involved parties to go green, and to reduce their carbon impact. So the economics is difficult. The price of carbon credits is low, in part because there's questions about whether the credits are legitimate. And the cost of producing the high quality verified credits is high because of the soil sampling costs in part. So what we're trying to do is bring technology in to address these issues. So this lots of paperwork from the farmers in orange, we're hoping to reduce that by being able to remotely sense practices and use other technologies to verify what farmers have done without them having to fill out lots of paperwork. In yellow there, we've just put our methods on a third-party registry. And that was a couple of months ago. So we're going through the process of having all of our methods and technology validated. And then we're working on coming up with, or part of what we have submitted to this registry is this combined method where we have soil sampling, but reduced amount of soil sampling combined with modeling. So the idea is that the modeling will take over a bunch from the soil sampling that will drive the price, or I should say the cost of the soil sampling down. And so hopefully we can reduce these sort of barriers and make it more palatable to farmers, make it more trustworthy for buyers, and make the whole market work a bit better. Yeah, so that's the end of part 3. And then I'm happy to answer questions or talk about any of the things that interested you in either of these parts.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much, Margaret. It's really exciting for me to learn a little bit more about some things that we've talked about in less detail in the past. I thought this was great. Maybe at this point we can stop the recording. Jill, if you're able to do that.